Yeah, you've got a huge tank, and the 1DX is even larger.
Right.
And so I had the NEX7, which I also reviewed for Before You Buy. Let
me just say,
that was like my smaller camera, but
there's one way really to get this much smaller, which is eliminate the mirror. If you look in digital SLRs, in fact, all SLRs traditionally have had a prism in these that acts as a mirror that allows the light from the lens to come up through into the viewfinder, and so that you can see the through the lens what you're going to get a picture of. But that is a big old mirror that you have to move out of the way. So lately we've seen a number of mirrorless solutions. Instead of having an optical prism that has to be moved up out of the way, adding to the size and the complexity of the body, these cameras now use electronic viewfinder, essentially a video tap that looks through the lens, and then you see what the camera is going to see through the viewfinder. We want to put this back on because that's the actual sensor in there.
That's the actual sensor.
You might want to put your lens back on there. You know what's worst? Somebody told me micro spittle.
Oh, yeah. Well, you don't want to get anything wet or anything oily or greasy
and
in
spit is a little acidic, so it can actually etch the surface of your full frame.
Yeah.
So this is exciting. As you mentioned, the NEX, I bought Olympus OMD, which is a micro four thirds. Your NEX7 is an APS-C sensor.
It was a small sensor as well.
These small cameras have, until now, except for the very, very high-end cameras, have... Like, for instance...
there's been a couple of, like, fixed full frame. I think Sony, was it the RX1
and
or
what's
something
the
like that?
What's the really expensive one? I can always forget the name of it because I don't want to think about it. Leica, that's it.
M8 or something?
Yeah, so they've had full frame sensors, but it's very rare in the mirrorless sphere. Then Sony put the world in a tizzy last fall.
So Sony said, we're going to put a huge sensor in our kind of mirrorless body, and nobody had done that before, and it's exciting for a lot of reasons because it means you don't have to carry around that huge camera to get a full frame quality picture. And it's the one thing where, you know, I have a full frame camera and it's large, and I have to decide, is it worth bringing around the huge 5D Mark III, the 1DX, especially if you're traveling. You know, it's just a lot more to go with.
Well, in fact,
just the battery charger for my 1DX is larger than this entire camera.
The preview versions of this is you have the A7, I have the A7R. We'll talk about the differences in a second. But the preview versions of these cameras were seeded out to some of the world's best-known photographers to universal raves.
There was a lot of sort of hype and a lot of you know, pre-ordering. I think I got my pre-order in like a day after it was announced, or the same day. So
Trey Ratcliffe, very famously, who had just recently given up his full-bodied Nikon DSLRs for the Sony NEX cameras, went the next step, gave them up for this. He is now, there is a point to be made with this, that he is a landscape photographer. But he's decided, Trey Ratcliffe has decided to do all of his shooting now with his A7R. He was using a D800 and a D800E, and this is actually the same sensor as in the Nikon D800E. So I think it's an easy transition for him to make.
Yeah, and this is very similar to the D800. So you're essentially getting a cheaper version of that.
Yeah, because that's like a $3,000 or $4,000 body, right?
Yeah. So the A7, this body only retails for around $1,700, like $1,698, somewhere around there. And there's a kit version that's also available that has a 28 to 70 kind of zoom lens, but it also has optical stabilization. So you can get it in a kit with a lens, which is probably what most people are going to do if it's their only camera. But I'm
so it's about $2,000 with the lens.
Yeah, it's about $2,000 with the lens. But I'm a fan of buying the body and then just using either my existing lenses or picking exactly what I want. I don't necessarily want what is in a kit lens.
What are the specs of that A7?
So the specs on the A7 is that you get a 24.3 megapixel full frame sensor with 14-bit RAW. And so that it's already quite large. The A7R, I believe, is 36, but it's a little bit higher. You do get a phase detect autofocus, which is really nice in the A7 because it means that in the actual sensor, there are phase detect for high quality autofocus. So it's a little better at, you know, acquiring an accurate autofocus or continuous tracking and for things like that. Does about 5 frames a second. And you have a lot of great features. The electronic viewfinder, I had this on the NEX7, and it was a little laggy, a little kind of floaty and blurry, especially in lower light, and they've significantly improved it in the A7. and the A7R has the same viewfinder as well.
So the big difference between the A7 and the A7R is that this is 39 megapixels.
Yeah, 39.
It's a larger, it's the same sensor, both full-frame sensors,
Right.
but it's just a higher resolution. That's not necessarily a pro. You're going to get better low-light performance, for instance, on the A7.
Right, so the
A7R.
low light and high ISO performance is a little bit better on the A7 than the A7R,
Yeah.
but the A7R also removes the anti-aliasing filter.
That's like the D800E.
Which is like the D800E.
And now there's pros and cons to that. It means
Right.
that moiréing is more likely, right?
Right, so with a shirt like what Leo's wearing right now, it's got a very fine kind of linen pattern.
You probably
to
can't
it.
even see it.
You probably can't see it on the cameras, but that's the kind of pattern that can show in certain environments a kind of moire effect, which looks sort of like a rainbow.
Yeah.
And the issue with that is that that's something that you can't really correct later in RAW easily. There are, removal software and things like that, but it's something that's not as simple as a simple vignetting or distortion or
now,
another correction.
I should point out this doesn't happen that often.
Right.
You would be able to see it in the electronic
Yes, and you'd
viewfinder,
see it on your
and then a
picture.
minor adjustment to the zoom
Yeah.
or the focus would generally fix that.
The benefit is that you don't get this essentially blur filter that is placed
Softening
over.
it.
It's a softening filter that's placed over the sensor. So the issue is that you're trading the phase detect sensors for the lack of a AF filter. So
that's the side effect.
So that's the side effect.
So there's two
If you
things.
go
You no longer have
A7R
the anti-moire, and you no longer have phase detect focusing.
Well, so you lose the phase detect focusing when you do the A7R, which
This
is the one
uses
right.
peak
So that
focusing.
uses contrast. and
Contrast,
peak.
yeah.
And so the regular A7 still has the phase detect, which means it should be more accurate for focusing. However, I felt it was still a little slow, and it's not the kind of thing. Either of these cameras are not going to be the kind of thing you're going to see at the Olympics for sports.
They're not very fast.
They're not very fast.
Now, one of the other things that people really liked about this, I'll give you a negative right up front. There are only currently 2 lenses available. You can use the NEX E lenses,
Right,
but
which
they're
are
cropped because it's an APS sensor. So if you want to take advantage of the full frame sensor, don't worry, that's just an $8,000 lens. It's no big deal. If you want to use we'll put that up on something more stable. If you want to use other third-party lenses, you can use an adapter. There are a number of companies that make these. This is a MetaBones adapter, about $400 adapter.
Which I have the same adapter.
It allows,
so that I can use my camera.
and they make this for a variety of lenses. I'm using here. These are the same lenses I use with my Canon 5D Mark II. These are the good Canon L lenses with the adapter. What's nice about the MetaBones adapter, unlike some of them, is that all the electronics still work.
Yes.
So
you'll
autofocus,
keep
everything.
autofocus,
But what's not so
aperture.
nice is it really slow.
Yes.
So slow that you almost always end up using manual focus.
Right.
And now that is one of the things that these cameras are very good at, is manual focus. They have one feature is an auto zoom on the EVF that lets you see very closely.
Right.
You don't have peaking in yours,
No,
do
these
you?
do peaking
They
as
do,
well.
okay.
That's the other thing. I mean, you would think, if this was a Canon would limit the features and firmware of what is in the A7 compared to the A7R, because it's just sort of what they do when you look at the different lineups of Canon.
That does everything that the R does.
Everything that the R does. So
So peaking is nice.
The peaking.
It'll show you where it's focused, and it'll light up where
Right.
it's
So
peak
what it does is, if you haven't seen it before, is it highlights high contrast edges. So it's sort of like running a edge detection and a contrast detection, and it will along the trim. So like you would see, if you were looking at me through this sort of peaking filter, as you were manually focusing forward and back, you would see that the most in focus is going to have little peaking along all the contrast
cool.
areas. You'll have little like ridges of the color that you choose, and you can choose white, red, or yellow.
The point being, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the pros and cons. I think we should start talking about how we use it. But the point being, manual focus is actually a very relatively easy thing to do in here.
And I've gone from using autofocus all the time on the back button AF on my 1D and my 5Ds to, for the last couple trips I took the A7 on, 99% manual focus.
Not so great on horse races or lacrosse tournaments.
But for what I was doing, it was actually really nice.
And that's my point.
In the way.
One of the reasons a person like Trey Ratcliffe really likes this camera is he's doing landscapes.
Yeah.
And if you're using a tripod and you don't have to, if you're not shooting birds in flight, you don't have to, the autofocus is a little slow even on using the actual
Sony
lenses,
native lenses,
the native lenses, the so-called FE lenses, full frame E lenses. So I guess the point I would make is there's only 2 native lenses now. They're good. This is probably the best of them. This is a 55 millimeter 1.8. There's also a, what is it, a 30?
There's a 35.
28.
I want to say a 28-1.8.
There's a 28, 35 zoom, and then anyways.
There's a couple that's available now. There's 12 in the roadmap, and there's 2 or 3 that are coming out in the next couple months.
The roadmap going to the end of next year.
Roadmap
but
goes
they
to
are
the end
promising
of next
a lot
year,
of lenses.
I've got a lens on.
Here's the first thing I would say is, while a lot of people, including Trey, talk about using adapters and using their beautiful Leica lenses on this thing, be aware that you're probably going to be doing manual focus. It's going to be like you do with a Leica. It's going to be a little bit finicky, a little bit fussy. And it's for somebody who's willing to take the time. I've decided it's just too much work for me. I'm going to use the stock lens on this one.
If you see side by side,
it also has significantly
you have the
bulk.
MetaBones adapter on it.
Yeah.
It has to push, essentially the lens out. Right. So you end up with this huge lens, and what's happening is that you can't simply mount a lens that was designed for a system with a mirror box directly to a mirrorless camera, and that's why you have to stage it out, because you would lose your infinity focus. So if you were able to somehow tape the lens directly onto the camera, you would not have the ability to focus infinity
Having said that, so the combination of the Zeiss lens is a very good. This 55 millimeter is the one I'd recommend. With this body, makes a very compact, very nice shooter. I mean, the full frame, really, you notice it. It's very good. But it's finicky. You know, I've seen.
Well, they went with this retro design, right? So
I like the design. I don't mind all the dials.
It went a little retro, and they decided they did some good things. Like they got rid of the NEX7 kind of consumer menu, and they went to a more professional menu system that would be what you find on the regular Sony Alphas. It's very similar to Nikon and Canon menus, but they made some decisions with the body and handling where, the shutter button is right on top of the on-off switch, and it's in a very traditional location if you're on a film like an F series Nikon film camera. However, it's always a little awkward. You hold the camera now and you want in your grip, that's where your shutter is, but instead it's up here. You have to reach around and sort of change the placement from what's natural.
There have been some legitimate
little dials, and
there have been some legitimate complaints about the ergonomics. Some of the buttons are hard to reach.
And the electronic viewfinder, as good as it is, has an automatic sensor that decides you want to look through the viewfinder. You want to look at the screen on the back.
Well, when you put your eye up to it, the default would be, of course, the LCD, and it's a very good high-resolution LCD. But then when I put my eye up to the sensor, it will switch to the sensor.
And you have
a hard time. You find that
if you turn that around and
you're going to accidentally
show it to the camera. Anytime we have studio lights, so it's a little harder. But
I'm doing it just with my finger. Yeah,
you can just sort of cover it. And so what happens is, if you're trying to shoot low, like if you've got the tilt LCD.
I like that too.
And so if you're trying to shoot low, if you're trying to shoot in and tight and do some work like this, it'll keep blinking off, especially in dark.
And there's no manual button?
There is a manual button, but it takes you to the menu, which then forces you to scroll through the menu to select between auto and, But it's that sort of Sony thing where everything is buried in the menu settings. And
so you
can set it up, but
there's a lot to be said, and I don't want to, we could spend an hour on this.
Yeah, so photo stuff, it all really works exactly as you expect. It takes fantastic raw photos.
JPEGs, according to DP Review, have been very poor. I don't ever shoot JPEGs, so I
never set my stuff to JPEG in the first place.
Don't buy this to shoot JPEGs.
These are some photos that I shot. I've had the camera for a couple months, and I took it to San Antonio. I took it to Puerto Rico and to Paris, and so it's been my travel camera now. And I've always had regrets when I bring my NEX, when I bring point and shoot, when I
even
bring
the
small
NEX,
cameras, even the NEX, it's not as good.
Right.
And you don't have the depth of field. You don't
look
have
at the depth of field here. It's really nice.
It's really fantastic. So I can honestly say that I was able to go and use the camera and not think about, you think about some of the little issues, but you don't think, I wish I had my 1DX. I wish I had a 5D Mark III. I can't take this picture without it.
The quality is
superb. The quality is superb. And so having that. That being said, the video features, I don't have a video to show. However, this checks every single box that you would really want to have for video on a DSLR.
Yeah.
And so
including external microphone capability.
Yeah. So you get external microphone, you get headphones, you get audio levels.
You can actually see meters on the screen,
which is missing from a lot. You also get, which is super important, clean 1080p video output, which means it's uncompressed. You can use a Blackmagic recorder. You can use an Atomos from a Atomos Ninja or Samurai or something like that. Key Pro. You can basically get extremely high quality video directly out of the camera.